Hi guys, so the other database service that I want to teach you is Amazon DynamoDB. So Amazon DynamoDB is a database by Amazon themselves. They've created this and it's a fully managed service. And what you do with DynamoDB is you don't create databases, you create tables. So you're creating a table on an existing database. It's a NoSQL type of database, also known as a non-relational database. And that really means that you've got a bit more flexibility with the schema and what attributes you associate with the items in your table. I'll tell you more about that shortly. With DynamoDB, you can scale horizontally, and it's known as seamless scaling. That means you don't get any system downtime. It will scale either automatically or based on you changing the parameters associated with performance. And it does so in a horizontal way. So essentially your data is being spread across more partitions and underlying hardware. The data also gets replicated across multiple availability zones within a region for durability. So let's have a look at what DynamoDB is made up of. Firstly, you have tables. So that's everything you see here. So you create a table and all your data is stored within it. You then have items. So these are essentially rows in your table. You then have attributes, and the attributes are associated with each of your items. So that's it for the theory. Let's head over to the console and create a table on DynamoDB. On the AWS Management Console, we're going to go to Services, Database, and then DynamoDB. And so what we can do on DynamoDB is create a table, and let's just call this one Digital Cloud. And we can now create what's called a partition key. And so this is going to be something like the employee ID or the email or something associated with the item in the table that is unique, because it's used for searching the database. So what I'm going to do here is I'll just create it as first name. And then we could use the last name as the sort key, which is another way you can then sort the information in your table. And each of these can be a string, a binary, or a number. So we'll leave that on string. I'm going to deselect default settings just so I can show you a couple of things here. So firstly, we have the performance attributes, so the read-write capacity mode. These are called read capacity units and write capacity units. You can either have it on provisioned, where you can then use auto scaling or specify the amounts yourself, or you can have it on demand. I'm going to leave it on provisioned, and I'm going to disable the auto scaling and just use provisioned. And we'll just knock this down to, let's say, 3 read capacity units and 3 write. You don't have to do that. You're not going to have this for very long, so it won't cost you much. You can see here the estimated cost for a whole month of usage. You could then choose to encrypt your database. I'm just going to click create, and our table is being created. And that should just take a few seconds to create normally. And now we can actually go in to our table and we're able to create items. So for example, my first item can be Neil. Let's put the last name as Davis and click on save. And then let's add another one. Maybe this is Paul. Surname is Jones, and click on save. So I can easily manually populate items. Now I can also add other attributes. So for instance, maybe for Neil, I can add in a number, and this is going to be employee ID. And then let's put in some kind of number here and click on save. So now Neil has an employee ID, but Paul doesn't. Now for Paul, we could then go in, for example, and maybe we're going to give him a string, and it's going to be country, and he's in the USA. So let's click on save, and now he has an attribute. So this is very characteristic of a NoSQL database. You can have different attributes for different items in your table, and you don't even have to have something in each of these for the items. So for example, Paul doesn't have an employee ID in the table, and I don't have a country. So that's a quick example of creating a table. What we're going to do now is we're going to create another table. This one's going to be called My Store. The partition key is going to be client ID. The sort key is going to be created. and we'll leave the default settings for this one. And I'm going to click on create. So there's a couple of files which you'll find in the code and files directory of your course download under DynamoDB, and then we've got this DynamoDB CLI commands and mystore.json. So firstly, what we're going to do is we're going to use this command here to actually import some data. Now to do so, we need to have this mystore.json file. So what you need to do is make sure that you copy that file to the directory where you're actually running your command from. So make sure you're in a directory where you have the mystore.json file. And then what you need to do is enter this command. Now in my case, I need to do -- profile cloud beginners to make sure that I use the correct AWS account. So now let's hit enter. So that looks good. That's what I wanted to see. There's no unprocessed items. So what we do now is go back and have a look in our table. So let's go to items, and you can now see it's actually populated a whole series of items. And as you can see, we have items with different attributes. So we have the curated, which is a timestamp, so that's a date. We then have the category, which is a string, the price, which is a number, the quantity, which is a number, the SKU, which is a string, and so on. And also some of the items don't have certain attributes defined as well. And you can also see, even on an individual item basis, under weight here we have a string for iPhone, and then we have a number for this other option here. So lots of flexibility with the way that you use a non-relational database. Let's go back to the code, and I'm just going to quickly show you at a high level what we did. So we ran a command to do what's called a batch write item. So that's an API command that allows us to write items. And we took those items from this JSON file, so they're written in the JavaScript object notation language. So if we come into this file, you'll see that the table name is specified. We're doing what's called a put request because it's a HTTP API, so we're actually doing a put request to put the data. And then you can see we've got an item, and the client ID was part of that partition key. Remember, that's the primary key. And then for each of these items, we then have these attributes defined. So we've got a string here, which is the email address of the user, a string which is the timestamp, and if we go down a bit further, you can see a number here for quantity. And so we just did that for a whole series of items. Now I showed you this just to give you a bit more of an insight into the sorts of things you can do with AWS when you're using the API. So in this case, we populated our table with a whole load of data. Another thing we can do now from the command line is actually search our database. And there's a couple of ways we can do that. Firstly, with what's called a scan. And a scan will scan the entire table. So let's copy this, hit enter, and what I need to do again for me is put in this profile because I've got multiple accounts. So I put in my profile, and now I'll run the scan, and it's actually given us all this information. So if I just keep hitting the spacebar here, it's just going through, and it's just basically given us a dump of the table. The other way is we could query, and when we query, we can get a bit more specific. So in this case, we're identifying the name of the table, and then we're specifying some conditions, and we're looking for something in particular. And what we're going to try and do is identify this particular user and return only that result. So I'm going to copy this to my clipboard, come back and paste it in, and then for me, I'm going to put the profile, cloud beginners. Again, if you don't have multiple AWS accounts, you don't need to add this on. I'm just going to hit enter, and sure enough I get this response, which is chris@example.com, which is exactly what I was looking for. And he's mentioned a few times, so there's a count of 4. And I've given you a couple of examples here of doing the same sort of thing. So for example, this one is using a slightly different expression, looking for the client ID's name, and again it's looking for chris@example.com. So let's paste that one in, put in my profile, and we get this result. So we get the count of 4 again, so the same sort of thing, but with a slightly different command. So again, it's just to give you a bit of an insight into the API and how you can work from the command line with AWS. There's loads more to it, and if you're really interested in DynamoDB, you should have a look at my developer course where I go into a lot of detail, and there's lots more examples of using the API. For this particular lesson, we're finished now, so I'm just going to come back and delete my table, and all we have to do is type delete, and we can delete that one, and then go back into this table as well and type delete, and off it goes. So I hope you enjoyed that, guys. I'll see you in the next lesson.